Winter came early that year, hard and uninvited. Frost clung to the pines like ash, and the wind carried a dry, whispering cold down from the ridge. By dusk, the mountains had turned silver and still, each breath of the forest frozen mid-motion. Smoke rose thinly from a single cabin at the base of the hollow, one curl of gray against a sky the color of pewter. Inside, Eli Harrow sat by the fire with a whetstone and his hunting knife, drawing slow, rhythmic strokes that echoed through the one-room shelter. His hands were strong but lined with old scars, the kind that came not from work, but from a life that had once demanded defense. The knife was sharp already. He honed it more from habit than need. It gave his hands something to do when memory pressed too close. He lived by the rules of the mountain. Keep your wood dry, your fire alive, your distance from others. The last part came easiest. Eli had built the cabin himself 10 years before, after the war, and after the town turned its back on him. They'd called him cold, dangerous, touched by death, and maybe they were right. He had buried more than comrades. He had buried a wife, a child not yet born, a name he no longer claimed. Night gathered early. The wind carried flakes that melted when they met the firelight seeping through the cabin's cracks. Eli poured coffee into a tin cup, black and bitter, and leaned back in his chair. The creak of wood was the only voice that shared his company. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft raps against the door. Yet in the deep silence of snow country it struck like thunder. Eli froze, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the door. Few souls traveled this high in winter. None came uninvited. The knock came again, weaker this time. A voice followed, frail and uneven. "Please," it said. "I'm sick. I can't walk far, just one night." Eli stood, every instinct urging caution. He'd heard enough stories. Travelers pretending need, then turning to theft or worse. But the voice didn't carry deceit. It carried exhaustion, the sound of a body near breaking. He lifted the latch. The door swung open to reveal a small old woman, her shoulders bowed under a wool shawl heavy with snow. She leaned on a cane fashioned from a twisted pine branch. Her hair, what little showed from beneath her hood, was white as the drift behind her. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin wind-chapped and trembling. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she whispered. "I've nowhere else to go." Eli said nothing at first. The wind pressed between them, sharp and searching. He studied her face, the deep lines, the clear eyes behind the fatigue. She wasn't a beggar by nature. Her manner had the dignity of someone who once stood tall but had been worn down by time. Finally, he stepped aside. "You can come in," he said quietly. She crossed the threshold like someone stepping into a memory, slow, cautious, almost reverent. The warmth made her flinch, then sigh. Eli shut the door behind her and stoked the fire. "Sit there," he said, nodding toward the chair near the hearth. She hesitated, glancing toward the cot against the far wall. "I'll not take your seat," she murmured. "You'll take what I tell you," Eli replied, his tone steady but not unkind. He ladled hot water into a tin mug and stirred in a pinch of dried herbs. "Drink. It'll help the chill." She accepted it with both hands, trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, the kind that filled silence instead of breaking it. Eli returned to his own chair, watching the flames. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from. Questions brought stories, and stories brought sorrow. He'd had his fill of both. For a long time, only the fire spoke. It cracked and hissed, casting thin shadows on the log walls. The old woman coughed once, low and rough, then leaned back with eyes half shut. Steam curled from her cup. Outside, the storm began in earnest, wind clawing at the chimney, snow scraping across the roof like fingers. After a while, Eli said quietly, "There's stew. If you can stomach it," she nodded, too tired to speak. He filled a small bowl, thick with beans and venison, and set it near her. Her hands shook as she ate, but she finished every spoonful. When she was done, she looked at him for the first time with something more than gratitude, something almost like recognition. "You live up here alone?" she asked softly. Eli gave a single nod. "Long enough. Not afraid of the cold." "The cold's honest," he said. "Can't say that for most men." A faint smile touched her lips, weary but real. "Then we have that in common." He looked at her again, curious despite himself. Her shawl had fallen open. Beneath it, he caught the glint of a small silver locket hanging at her throat. He turned back to the fire before she noticed his glance. The night deepened. The wind grew crueler, beating at the shutters. Eli checked the rifle by the door, then sat again, wrapping a blanket over his knees. The woman had drifted into uneasy sleep, her cane resting against the wall, her breath thin but steady. He watched her for a moment. Something about her face, the slope of the cheek, the stubborn line of her mouth, stirred a half-memory he couldn't place. Maybe she reminded him of someone from the war or from before. Maybe loneliness just played tricks in the firelight. He turned back to the flames, the knife still on the table beside him. Outside, wolves howled from the timberline, long, mournful cries that spoke of hunger and distance. Eli listened, not in fear but in recognition. The sound was part of him now, the language of the life he'd chosen. Inside, the firelight danced across two strangers who shared neither history nor future. Only a single night of warmth against the wilderness. And though Eli told himself it was just another act of decency, something in his chest shifted, slow and unfamiliar, like a door opening after years sealed shut. He didn't yet call it mercy. He didn't yet call it hope. But he did not close the door again that night. Morning came gray and brittle, the light thin as old parchment slipping through the cabin's frost-glazed window. The fire had burned low, only embers breathing faintly in the ash. Eli stirred from his chair, stiff from sleep, his blanket sliding to the floor. The smell of smoke and cold pine filled the room. For a moment he forgot she was there. Then the sound of a cough, deep, raw, and scraping, drew his eyes to the cot. The old woman lay curled beneath his spare quilt, her shoulders trembling with each labored breath. Her cane rested near her hand, her boots, cracked and stiff, sat by the hearth, their soles nearly worn through. Frostbite had claimed the tips of her fingers. Her feet were bruised and blistered where the leather had given out. Eli rose slowly, poured the last of the coffee into a pot, and set it near the coals. He didn't speak. Words were harder than work. Instead, he fetched clean rags, the old jar of salve he'd made from pine resin and bear fat, and crouched beside her. When she stirred, her eyes fluttered open, pale gray, like the winter sky outside. "Didn't think I'd wake," she rasped. "Would have been easier if you hadn't come this far," Eli said gruffly. He uncorked the salve and began to wrap her feet. Snow takes what it wants. She winced but didn't complain. "You're kind to tend a stranger." "I ain't kind," he muttered. "Just don't want a corpse in the cabin." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You talk rough, but your hands don't." Eli said nothing. His hands moved steady, practiced. He'd done this before. Field dressings, splints, bandages, though mostly for men who hadn't lived long enough to thank him. He tied the cloth carefully, avoiding her gaze. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Mara." She spoke it quietly, as if unsure it still belonged to her. He nodded once. "You're far from any settlement, Mara. Where were you heading?" "Nowhere, I suppose." She looked toward the window where snow drifted like ash. "Used to think there was a place left for me somewhere, but the map gets smaller every year." He studied her face, wondering how many winters she'd survived alone. "You traveling with anyone?" "Not anymore." The answer came too fast and too final. Eli turned back to his work, hiding the flicker of sympathy he felt. The mountain didn't forgive weakness. Neither did life. Still, something in her tone, that careful stillness, struck a note he recognized. Loss had a sound all its own, and hers echoed his. When he finished, she rested against the pillow, breathing slow. He rose, poured her a cup of the thin coffee, and set it beside her. Her hand trembled as she lifted it, revealing a small silver locket at her throat. It caught the firelight, worn, dented, but still gleaming in places where the chain rubbed smooth. The sight made Eli pause. He knew that shape. That engraved circle of vines and stars. He'd seen one like it before, long ago when he worked at Hollow Ridge Mine, a place that still haunted his dreams. Back then it had belonged to a miner's wife, a woman who'd pleaded for mercy when the company men came to drive her family off the land. A woman whose husband had been shot in the dirt for standing his ground. Eli's stomach tightened. He looked away before she noticed. "Where'd you get that locket?" he asked, his tone too sharp. Mara's hand rose to it instinctively. "This? Been mine a long while. From Hollow Ridge?" Her eyes flicked toward him, surprised. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. "Why do you ask?" she said at last. Eli turned to the fire. No reason, but reason burned in him like coal, heavy, black, unspent. He saw again the flames of the camp, the men shouting, the woman crying over her husband's body. He had been there that night, rifle in hand, sworn to uphold the law. Only later had he realized which law he'd served, the one written by men, not justice. The coffee boiled over. He didn't notice until it hissed against the coals. He swore under his breath, took the pot aside and tried to bury the past behind the day's chores, fetching wood, splitting kindling, fixing the latch. But the memory clung to him like smoke. By afternoon, the sky dimmed again. The wind whistled through the cracks, colder than before. Mara slept most of the day, waking only to sip broth or whisper a few words. Once she asked, "You were a soldier, weren't you?" Eli stopped stacking wood. "What makes you say that?" "You move like one. Careful. As if the ground might remember where you've stepped." He didn't answer. She was right. He'd fought in 2 wars, one for the Union, one for himself. Neither had brought peace. Later, when she slept again, he sat by the fire, studying her locket from across the room. It swung faintly when she breathed, flashing with each flicker of flame. He could have asked outright. Could have demanded to know if she was that woman, or kin to her. But something held him back. A quiet fear, maybe, that the past had finally come home and that it was too late to change what he'd done. Outside, the snow deepened. The sound of it, soft, endless, pressed against the cabin walls like a heartbeat. The world beyond was gone. There was only this small space of wood and breath and unspoken memory. Eli took out the knife again, not to sharpen it this time, but to hold it still in the light. Its reflection wavered, ghostly. He wondered how many men had looked into that steel before dying, and whether he was one of them in spirit long before his body followed. He glanced toward Mara. Her hand rested over the locket now, as if protecting it even in sleep. The firelight touched her face, showing strength beneath the lines of age. The same quiet resilience he remembered from that woman at the ridge. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe the mountain had a cruel way of bringing unfinished stories back to those who tried to hide from them. When Eli finally banked the fire for the night, the room sank into shadow. Only the faint glow of the coals and the whisper of wind filled the silence. He sat long after, listening to her breathing, steady, fragile, human. And as he watched her sleep, he realized something terrible and tender all at once. The past he had buried in snow and guilt had a heartbeat again. By the 3rd morning, the world outside had vanished. Snow came down in a thick white silence, swallowing the mountains whole. It filled the air, the trees, the spaces between breaths, until even sound seemed to freeze mid-air. The cabin, small as it was, felt like the last warm thing left in creation. Eli stood at the window, scraping frost from the glass with the back of his knife. Beyond it, nothing moved but the blur of falling snow. The sky and the ground were one unbroken sheet of white, the horizon gone. He couldn't tell where the forest ended or the storm began. Behind him, Mara coughed, a dry, tearing sound that bent her frame. She'd grown weaker with each hour, her fever rising, her eyes hollow and bright all at once. The salve had done little for her hands. Her skin had gone pale as the drifts outside. "You need rest," Eli said, though he knew she hadn't slept more than a handful of minutes since dawn. She smiled faintly from the cot. "Rest comes easy enough when it's time." He didn't answer. Instead, he stirred the pot of thin stew that simmered over the fire, its scent of venison and root vegetables barely filling the air. He had rationed carefully. The storm would close them off for days, maybe longer. When he turned, he saw her staring into the flames, lips moving faintly. At first he thought she was praying, But then he caught the names, whispered, broken, John. Clara, the ridge mine. The sound stopped him cold. Those words weren't prayers. They were memories. The ridge mine. Eli's gut tightened. He crouched beside her, careful not to startle her. Mara, he said quietly, you said a name, John. Who is he? Her gaze drifted past him, to some place beyond the walls. My husband, she murmured. He worked the mine. We lived near the ridge before. She trailed off, coughing hard enough that he reached for the cloth at her bedside. Before. He didn't need her to finish the sentence. He already knew. He'd seen what came after the word before, the company men, the rifles, the smoke curling over the valley. He'd stood there in uniform, carrying out orders he didn't believe in, watching a family's life scatter in the snow. He remembered a woman crying over a body, a little girl clutching her mother's shawl, the wind burning his face as he turned away. Now, decades later, that same voice, older, frailer, spoke from his cot. The mountain, it seemed, had a long memory. He rose suddenly, turning to the window again. His reflection stared back at him in the ice, bearded, weathered, eyes sunk deep in shadow. For the first time in years, he felt the sharp ache of shame, raw and human. The storm worsened by midday. Wind screamed down the ridge like a living thing, clawing at the roof. The shutters rattled. The chimney moaned. Eli worked quickly, reinforcing the door with an iron bar and nailing heavy planks over the windows. Snow crept in through the cracks, ghostly and persistent. He paused only when he heard something beyond the wind, a distant rhythm, muffled but deliberate. Hooves. Eli moved to the window, brushing frost away. At first he saw nothing but white, then faint shapes, moving low through the timberline. 3, maybe 4 riders, he cursed softly under his breath. Damn fools, he muttered. Nobody rides in weather like this unless they're running from worse. The sound grew closer, swallowed and released by the wind. Voices carried faintly, harsh, angry, half drowned in snow. Mara stirred. What is it? Riders, he said. Probably from the valley. Her eyes widened faintly. You'll let them in? Eli's jaw tightened. Not these ones. Rumors had a way of crawling through the mountains, carried by men who wanted more than they earned. He'd heard whispers of drifters looking for the hermit with gold, or the soldier with rifles. There wasn't much gold left, but there was still a rifle, and enough memory to use it if he had to. He crossed the room and took it down from its place on the wall. A Winchester, oiled and ready. He checked the chamber, then set it beside the table. Mara's voice cut through the howling wind, faint but steady. You've done enough killing, haven't you? Eli froze. Her words struck deeper than any bullet. He turned to her slowly and saw not accusation but sorrow. Fever glowed in her eyes like dying coals. Those men won't care for words, he said. They'll take what they can and burn what they can't. Then don't give them your soul, too. He looked away. Soul's long gone. Then prove it ain't, she whispered. He didn't answer. Outside, the riders shouted to each other, their voices swallowed by wind. Eli barred the door tighter, banking the fire low to dull its light. Shadows stretched across the cabin walls, tall and wavering. The storm raged harder, hammering the roof with fists of ice. The horses whinnied somewhere in the dark. Eli's pulse steadied into the rhythm of the storm. Not fear, but focus. Old habits returned, listening for the shift in snow under boots, measuring distance by echoes. Mara coughed again, her breath rattling. Between gasps, she murmured fragments. Not just names now, but scenes. A child's laughter, a gunshot, the smell of dust and fire. Eli stood there, each word cutting through the years like shards of glass. He thought of what he might say. That he'd been young, that orders were orders, that he hadn't known what would happen. But none of that mattered. Truth didn't excuse. It only demanded endurance. A thud shook the door. Then another. Someone outside cursed. The handle rattled. Eli grabbed the rifle, then stopped. Mara's hand, thin and trembling, rested on his arm. Her grip was weak, but her gaze fierce. Don't, she breathed. Let the storm do what men can't, it will pass. They will too, he met her eyes. For the first time in years, someone looked at him not with fear or pity, but with belief. Belief that he could choose peace even when violence beckoned. Outside, the pounding came again, then faded into the roar of wind. Shouts turned to silence. The horses' cries drifted farther and farther away, swallowed by snow. Eli lowered the rifle. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what he hadn't done. Hours passed before the storm began to ease. The wind softened to a low hum. The snow slowed to a steady fall. The cabin stood untouched. Mara slept at last, her breathing shallow but calm. Eli sat near the door, the rifle across his knees, watching the coals pulse with quiet light. For the first time in decades, he had faced danger without blood. The storm had asked what kind of man he was, and he had answered, not with bullets, but restraint. Outside, the world lay buried. Inside, something had begun to thaw. Days folded into one another like pages in a half-forgotten book. The storm eased, but the world outside remained sealed under a thick crust of snow. The mountains stood silent, their peaks swallowed by cloud. No sound reached the cabin except the crackle of fire, the whisper of the wind through the chimney, and the rasp of Mara's breathing in the long dark. Eli kept to his routines, splitting logs, mending gear, melting snow for water, anything to keep his hands busy. Still, the air in the cabin felt heavier each morning, as though the roof itself bent under the weight of unspoken things. Mara drifted in and out of sleep. Her cough deepened, but when she was awake, her voice carried a strange, quiet clarity. She began to speak more, not about her sickness or the storm, but of years long past, the kind of years Eli had spent trying to forget. She spoke of a small house near the ridge mine, the smell of iron and wet stone, the sound of her husband's boots returning at dusk. She spoke of her boy, a child with hair the color of wheat, who coughed one winter until he didn't breathe at all. After that, she said, silence became her only companion. Eli listened without a word. His hands moved, stirring stew, carving wood, checking the rifle, but his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Her story fit too neatly into the cracks of his own. The mining camp, the violence, the smoke rising from homes like hers. He had been there. Maybe not the cause, but never the shield. Sometimes, when she dozed, he would sit by the fire and stare at the silver locket that still hung at her neck. He wanted to ask about it, to see what memory it held inside, but something in him resisted. The locket was her heart, and he had already broken one too many of those. By the third day, the sky cleared. The sunlight spilled through the window, pale but real, turning the frost on the panes into lace. For the first time in weeks, Eli stepped outside. The cold was sharp enough to bite through his coat, but the air smelled clean, untouched. The snow reached his knees as he shoveled a narrow path to the woodpile. He looked out across the valley, a white ocean of stillness, and realized just how alone they truly were. Even if she died, there would be no one to bury her but him. Even if he froze, no one would find the bodies until spring. When he came back inside, she was awake. The firelight made her face look carved from wax, but her eyes were alert. She held a length of old rope in her lap. "I used to make these," she said, her voice papery but steady. "When my husband worked the mine, I'd weave spare rope from scraps. Came in handy more than once." Eli watched her fingers move, slow but sure, looping and twisting strands in practiced rhythm. "Show me," he said after a while. So she did. Their hands worked together, his rough, hers trembling, as she showed him how to braid 3 lengths into one, how to tie a slip knot that would hold under strain. Her voice softened when she taught. She might have been teaching her son again. "You've got strong hands," she murmured. "A man can make or unmake a thing with hands like those." Eli said nothing. He focused on the rope, on the strands coming together. It was a small thing, but it felt like building something that would last longer than a night's fire. When she grew tired, he took the rope from her gently and hung it on a peg by the door. Then he went to work mending her cane, tightening the binding, sanding the rough wood smooth. He worked by lamplight, his breath slow, the sound of her faint breathing behind him. When he handed it back, she smiled weakly. You fix things that don't want fixing. Habit, he said. She looked at him a long time before replying. No, that's hope. The words lingered. That evening, as snow began to fall again, she asked him, Why do you live so far from folks? Eli froze with the kettle in his hand. He didn't turn, because people take what they can't give back. The answer came too fast. Practiced, almost rehearsed. He set the kettle down hard enough that the lid clattered. When he finally met her gaze, she wasn't offended. She only nodded, her eyes soft with a kind of knowing sadness. Ain't that the truth, she said quietly. But hiding don't make it hurt less. He wanted to argue, to tell her that solitude had kept him alive, that peace was found only in distance. But he couldn't. Because when she said hiding, he felt it like a knife turning in his chest. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a wolf howled, low, lonely, the sound sliding down from the ridge. Another answered closer, then another. Eli crossed to the window and peered into the dusk. Shadows moved between the trees, lean gray shapes gliding over the snow. Wolves, half-starved, drawn by the smell of food and warmth. He reached for the rifle by instinct. Mara's voice stopped him. Let them be. They're just hungry. So am I, he said quietly. She coughed, a dry, brittle sound, then whispered, Not for meat, Eli Harrow. For mercy. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. In the dim light, her face seemed lit from within, not by fever now, but by something gentler, something human. The wolves prowled closer. Their howls became a circle around the cabin, but neither of them moved. The fear that might once have ruled him had softened into something else. A strange calm, born not of courage, but surrender. The sound faded after a while, leaving only the creak of wind against the eaves. The roof groaned, not in warning, but in weary companionship. Eli sat down by the fire again. Mara had fallen asleep, her head tilted toward the light. He watched her for a long time, the rhythm of her breath matching the slow settling of the storm. He realized then what the roof had come to mean, both shelter and cell. It had kept him alive all these years, but it had also kept him from the world, from forgiveness, from anything that felt like grace. Now, under that same roof, beside a dying woman he barely knew, he felt something shift. Survival, he understood, was not living. And living without forgiveness was only another way to die. Night settled heavy on the mountain, a hush so deep that even the fire dared not crack too loudly. Outside, the world lay buried under drifts of snow and moonlight. Inside, the cabin glowed like a small, stubborn lantern against the wilderness. Eli sat by the hearth, oiling the rifle he hoped never to use again. Across from him, Mara slept, her breath shallow, her hands folded on her chest like she was already halfway to peace. For the first time in weeks, Eli felt something close to calm. The storm had passed, the wolves had gone silent, and he could almost believe that the mountain itself was resting. Yet somewhere beneath that stillness another sound stirred, faint but real, the crunch of boots over snow. He froze. The sound came again, deliberate, cautious. More than one pair. He rose quietly, reaching for the rifle, moving to the window where frost had webbed the glass. Out beyond the tree line, shadows moved. Men, 3, maybe 4. Their lanterns swung low, casting brief glimmers on the snow. Eli's jaw tightened. These weren't wanderers. No one came this far up the mountain without reason. He turned toward the cot. Mara, he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with fever, but sharp beneath it. They've come, she said softly, as if she'd known all along. Who? Her gaze drifted toward the door. Ghosts in flesh. Before Eli could ask more, the first knock came. Hard, flat, the sound of authority without right. He didn't answer. A voice followed, slurred with cold and whiskey. Evening, old man. We heard there's warmth here, and maybe a stash or two worth sharing. Eli's silence was answer enough. The door rattled under a kick. He stepped forward, rifle in hand. You take one more step, he said, and this night ends worse than you planned. A laugh answered him, cruel, young, reckless. We ain't here to rob you blind, Grandpa. Just need a place to thaw. Don't make it ugly, the handle turned. The latch held once, twice, then splintered. The door burst inward, snow sweeping in like a tide. 3 men filled the threshold. Bearded, hard-eyed, the mountain kind who lived off rumor and hunger. One carried a shotgun, another a long knife. The third, their leader, had the calm look of a man who'd led trouble before. Eli raised his rifle steady. But before he could speak, another sound rose, soft, but cutting through everything. "Cole Danner," Mara said. Her voice, though frail, carried like iron through the room. The men stopped. The leader blinked, his breath clouding in the lamplight. "Who's asking?" She pulled back her shawl. The firelight caught her face, hollow cheeks, silver hair, eyes clear as ice. For a heartbeat, the man looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Mara Winton," she said. "You remember me." The name hit him like a blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Behind him, one of the younger men shifted uneasily. Eli stood frozen, watching the air between them burn. "I thought you died," Cole muttered finally. "All of you. After the ridge went bad, after you made it go bad," she interrupted. "You and your kind. You took the claim, burned the camp, left widows in the snow. My husband never came home. My boy never saw spring." Her words were slow, not angry, too tired for fury, too true for mercy. Eli lowered the rifle slightly. The firelight wavered between them, painting the room in gold and shadow. Cole looked at the floor. "We were told to drive folks out." "Orders from town." You just followed," Mara said. "And where did that lead you, Cole Danner?" "Up here robbing hermits for scraps? That's what's left of the man who stole another's life?" The younger men looked at each other, shame crawling across their faces. One backed toward the door. The storm outside had stilled, but the quiet inside was louder than thunder. Cole met her eyes again. "If you came for revenge, I came for rest," she said simply. "And you came for warmth. Maybe we both found what we deserve." Eli could feel the weight of the moment, thick as smoke. No one moved. The fire hissed. A log cracked. Then Mara lifted her chin and said, "Leave this place. Don't take more than the world's already given you." Cole hesitated, then lowered his weapon. He looked at Eli, saw the rifle still in his hands but the calm behind his eyes, and something inside him broke. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and turned toward the door. "Come on," he told the others. His voice was hoarse. "We're done here." They left without another word. The wind swallowed them, their lanterns fading into the snow. Eli closed the door and dropped the latch back into place. For a long while, neither he nor Mara spoke. The only sound was the sighing of the wind and the slow collapse of a burning log. Finally, he turned to her. "You knew him. I knew the kind," she whispered. "Every man carries a reckoning. Some just take longer to meet it." Her strength was fading fast. Sweat gleamed on her forehead, her breath short and shallow. Eli knelt beside her, unsure what to do with his hands, his heart. "You did right tonight," she murmured. He shook his head. "I didn't do anything." "You stood beside me," she said. Her voice was barely a thread now. "You didn't hide this time." He reached for her hand. It felt weightless. The fire burned low, light sinking into ember. Her eyes fluttered once, twice, then fixed on him with sudden clarity. "You did right this time," she whispered. And then, with a breath that sounded almost like a sigh of relief, she was gone. Eli sat there long after her hand grew cold in his. The room was still, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and snow. Outside, dawn was beginning to pale the horizon, but he did not move. He watched the last of the flames curl around the blackened wood until they faded into ash. The fire between them had burned everything away. Fear, guilt, loneliness, leaving only truth behind. And in that truth, for the first time in years, Eli Harrow felt something like grace. Weeks passed before the storm finally broke. The mountain thawed slow, as if reluctant to let go of winter's hold. The drifts along the ridge softened into rivulets that whispered down the slope. Birds returned in cautious pairs. Sap bled from the pines. In the clearing where Eli's cabin stood, the snow receded to reveal dark earth and one small wooden cross. Eli rose with the dawn each day, feeding the mule, cutting wood, and tending to that mound of soil as though it were a living thing. The rope she had taught him to braid hung beside the door. Her cane leaned against the wall, untouched. The cabin smelled faintly of sage and smoke. He no longer spoke much, even to himself. Silence had changed meaning. It was no longer a wall. It was prayer. One morning, the sound of hooves came climbing up the ridge. 3 riders appeared through the thinning fog. Lawmen from the valley, their coats dusted white, their faces drawn tight from cold and duty. Eli watched them approach but didn't rise. He sat on the porch rail, whittling the handle of an old tool, the rifle nowhere in sight. "Eli Harrow," the lead rider called. His tone wasn't hostile, just cautious. "We've had word from the valley. Heard there was trouble up this way. Smoke, gunfire, men gone missing." Eli set the tool down. "There was trouble," he said. "But it's done now." The men dismounted. The youngest of them looked around. The single cabin, the bare corral, the mound of earth marked by a cross made of pine. "That grave hers?" he asked quietly. Eli nodded. "She came here sick. Didn't make it through." The older lawman stepped closer, boots sinking into thawed mud. "Anyone else?" "3 men came one night," Eli said. "Didn't stay long. Left with their sins still heavy. You shoot 'em." He met the man's eyes. "No need." There was no bravado in his tone, no defense, no confession. Just truth, stripped bare as bone. The lawmen looked at one another. They could see it in him, a kind of peace that men didn't fake. After a moment, the oldest of them tipped his hat toward the grave. "We'll report it settled." They turned to leave, but one paused, glancing back. "What was her name, if it's fit for the record?" Eli looked at the cross, a plain marker, unadorned except for a single braid of rope tied near the center. The morning sun caught on it, making the strands glow gold. He hesitated only a moment before saying softly, "Mara Harrow." The lawman's brow furrowed. "Kin," Eli nodded once. "Now she is." They said nothing more. The riders mounted and began their descent, their shapes shrinking into the mist below. Eli watched them go until they were swallowed by the trees. Then he turned back to the grave. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of thawing pine and wet soil. It smelled like beginnings. He crouched beside the cross and placed the silver locket at its base. He had opened it once, only once, days after her passing. Inside was a faded sketch of a man and child, drawn in hurried pencil strokes. The faces were nearly gone, but the love in them was still clear. He had closed it, looped it on a string, and worn it against his chest since then. Now, as the earth warmed, he laid it down again. "You don't need me keeping this," he murmured. "You're home." The wind rustled through the trees, and for an instant, it sounded like her voice, soft, steady, forgiving. When the first true spring rain came, Eli saddled the mule. He packed light, a bedroll, a small sack of flour, his knife, and the rope she'd braided. He tied it across the saddle horn, the braid bright against the worn leather. He stood for a long time on the threshold of the cabin. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The chair by the hearth still held the shape of her shawl where it had once hung. Every shadow inside was familiar, every sound a ghost. He touched the doorframe one last time, then turned his back on it. The path down the mountain was slow, narrow, half buried by melting snow. The mule's hooves broke through patches of ice, splashing into the mud below. In the distance, the valley spread wide and green, the first shoots of grass rising where frost had ruled. Eli rode with his hat low, the cold air biting his cheeks. The farther he went, the lighter the sky became. The world below was waking, smoke rising from distant homesteads, a river cutting silver through the plain, the faint echo of a church bell carried on the wind. At a bend in the trail, he stopped and looked back. The ridge was nearly lost to the clouds now, the cabin invisible in the white blur of distance. Only the faint curl of smoke remained, the last trace of the life he'd lived, burning clean into the morning. He breathed deep. The air tasted different down here, softer, carrying the scent of thaw and wood fire, of people. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to turn away from it. He rode until the sun slipped low behind the peaks. When he came to the old split in the road, one path toward the abandoned ridge mine, the other toward the nearest town, he paused. The mine road was still there, half collapsed and eaten by weeds. He stared at it a long while, remembering the smoke, the shouting, the sound of boots on gravel, the day he'd become the man who ran instead of stayed. Then, slowly he turned the mule toward the town. The sky burned with evening light, gold on snow, blue on the far peaks. The rope swayed at his saddle, the braid catching every flicker of sun. It felt like a hand guiding him home. He didn't know what waited down there, forgiveness, or just another kind of solitude. But he knew this. He would walk among people again. He would speak when spoken to. He would share fire without fear. As the trail widened and the valley opened before him, he murmured almost to himself, "You did right this time." The wind caught the words and carried them back up the ridge, over the trees, across the grave where spring flowers had begun to bloom. And though no one heard it but the mountain, it was enough. The mountain, once his prison, had become his witness.